Thank you for joining today's webinar, Modernize Now, Replace Over Time, presented by Raul Menendez. There are a few housekeeping items that I want to make you aware of before I introduce today's presenter. Participants today will be in listen-only mode, and we will be recording the webinar. There will be a brief question and answer session at the conclusion of today's webcast. During the presentation, we encourage you to submit questions by leveraging the Q&A panel, which is in your primary docking window, and it's usually off to the right of your screen. At this time, I am pleased to introduce your presenter for today. Raul Menendez is a 12-year novice in the enterprise modernization space. He is a published author, co-writing 4 books on the topics of mainframe COBOL, CICS, and JCL. Raul helps companies cost-effectively modernize their mainframe and distributed COBOL systems. He happens to be the Director of Development for Migration Software here at GT Software. He guides feature set direction for the NetCOBOL family of compilers. He oversees the NeoSuite mainframe migration and modernization product line. He's a great asset to GT Software, and we love how he always pulls in user case stories when presenting. And at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Raul Menendez. Raul, welcome.
Thanks, Marge. Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining our webinar. As Marge said, my name is Raul Menendez, and today we're going to be talking about what the advantages are to modernizing your COBOL code base and then replacing parts of it over time as it makes sense to do so. So let's go ahead and get started. First, a little bit about GT Software. GT's been in the modernization business for about 30 years now. We have solutions for both integration and migration. It's what we like to call our GT Continuum. So on the integration side, we have our Ivory product line, which makes it possible to expose your mainframe transactions and data as web services and SQL calls. Over on the migration side, we have our NeoSuite product line, which helps you take your CICS COBOL applications and your batch processes and move them over into a Windows server environment using .NET. We also happen to be the global reseller for Fujitsu's NetCOBOL product line of compilers. And we have technologies that will help you convert your Microfocus code and your AccuCOBOL code over to NetCOBOL. Lastly, for those customers that are in need of application assessment, we have code assessment software and services that could help you out with that. Not only do we help you figure out what you have in your environment, but we also help identify areas of concern or areas of risk. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be making a case on why we think it makes more sense to reuse rather than replace your existing COBOL applications. Moving to a more agile environment can make improving and extending those applications a lot easier. You know, also once you're in that agile environment, it becomes easier to replace those COBOL components that may not necessarily be up to par. You could do that now slowly and over time using some other more modern languages. You know, at GT, we believe that the best way to do that is with our NetCOBOL for .NET compiler and the Microsoft .NET framework. So to illustrate that, a little later on, I'll be showing you a demo where I take a C# front-end application and I have it communicate with some legacy COBOL business logic on the back end. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is how moving your COBOL into a .NET environment will make it possible for you to be able to hire developers with .NET experience and perhaps experience in other .NET languages as well, and how NetCOBOL can also help with your existing COBOL staff, help them transition and make that jump into .NET. So, first a little bit about the prevalence of COBOL in the world today. COBOL is an old language. You know, the industry has made a very big investment in COBOL over the years. There's a lot of code out there. In fact, it's estimated that about 70 to 75% of the business and transactional systems around the world run on COBOL. You know, if there's an industry you can think of, there's a high likelihood that COBOL has a footprint in it. COBOL also is still the language of choice for a lot of the global financial transactions that are occurring today. And Gartner estimates that there are still around 200 billion lines of COBOL in use. So the point here is that COBOL is going to be around for quite a while longer. And why? Well, it's still a well-suited language for business transactions. So here's an age-old question. You have an aging COBOL application that you're finding harder and harder to maintain. It's hard to advance, and heck, you know, you're even having a hard time finding qualified COBOL developers to maintain it. So with that kind of situation, aren't you just better off replacing your old COBOL code with some off-the-shelf software, or maybe consider a complete rewrite? The problem with that approach is that you'd be throwing out all of your tried and true business logic. You know, these are the programs that hold your company's institutional memory. They know why things are processed in a specific way. Complete rewrites can also be very costly, and they usually take much longer than you originally anticipated they will take. And they're often met with failure, or at the very least, they fail to hit the mark on what they were trying to replace. So we believe that there's a better way. What we propose is that you start by modernizing your COBOL applications today, and then later replace them with those COBOL components with something new as needed. So the first step, you got to get your COBOL applications into that modern and cost-effective setting. So what are some of the benefits to modernizing your COBOL? Well, there may be some competitive requirements that you have. You know, is there any new functionality that your current application lacks? Financial considerations may be important to you as well. You know, there are a lot of companies out there that are facing some economic challenges, and having the ability to reduce your IT costs can be a great way to save money, maybe even save some jobs. You know, originally when many of these COBOL applications were written, green screens or limited GUI UIs were really the only options that users had for interacting with the application. But that's not the case anymore. What you're probably finding are that users are asking, or maybe even demanding, new ways to access those applications. And that can be done in a number of ways: web interfaces, exposing your applications as web services, maybe even mobile apps. It can also be challenging to maintain the COBOL you have with the current tools that are at your disposal. So moving to a newer environment can really open up a whole new world there as well. So I was talking to one of our customers a couple of weeks ago. They were a customer who migrated off the mainframe into our NeoSuite tools and our NetCOBOL for .NET environment. And they did this migration about a couple of years ago, and so they've been happily chugging along now in their new environment. And I asked them, you know, some time's passed already. Have you been replacing that old COBOL code that you originally started out with? And what he told me was something that was very interesting. He said that there really are only two scenarios that he sees on why he would ever replace the code. One, if that code is hard to maintain, and so in their situation, they did have a couple of batch applications that they were having to go in and do a lot of tweaks to. So for that, they did replace it with some C# code. Then the other scenario we talked about were applications or programs that really no longer fit the need for that company, for their company, and so again, they replaced those. But when I asked about the rest of his programs, the rest of the application, what he told me was, you know, it's resource intensive, time intensive, and cost intensive to replace a lot of those applications. So his philosophy is, if it's not broke, why fix it? So I thought that was really interesting. So Marge, why don't we go ahead and do our first poll?
Okay, thank you. I'll launch it. And if everybody could take a few seconds and answer this question: what compiler do you use today? NetExpress, AccuCobol, or other? And they're starting to come in. I'll give it a few more seconds. If everybody can poll, that would be great. Okay. I'm going to close that poll. And I will share it. And this is interesting. And Raul, tell me if this is what you usually see out in the field. 69% are using other compilers, 23% are using AccuCobol, and 15% NetExpress.
That actually is kind of interesting. It'd be interesting to see what those other compiler brands are.
Yep.
So very interesting. Good information.
Great. Okay, so we can get going back to the presentation. Thank you.
All right, great. So, there are some risks associated to modernizing your COBOL. And what we found to be successful is that you really need to do some upfront assessment. You need to be able to make sure that you completely understand the environment that you're in right now. If you don't, we recommend that you do a formal assessment to figure out what it is that you have. You also have to make sure that you understand what skill sets you have at your disposal today. Are your development team members willing to take on and learn a new technology? And if they are, you want to make sure that you allocate enough training time. You want them to be able to get up and running and productive as quickly as possible. And also, I can't stress this enough, but please allocate enough time for adequate testing. What we find is that the customers that have the best outcomes are the ones that take their testing very seriously and are thorough with it. So to mitigate some of the risks involved with the modernization effort, what we recommend is that you preserve those high-risk elements and only modernize or rewrite the lower-risk elements. So let me explain what I mean by that. By high risk, I'm talking about the portions of your application that have evolved over the years. This would be your business logic, how data is validated, how it's processed, the business process flow. It's also your core application code. It's the code that if you were to rewrite it and not rewrite it correctly could adversely affect your business. You also have to consider your data structures as high risk. So, where's your data kept today? How's it accessed? Does your application use a database, index files, vSAN files, or some combination of all of the above? We do have options available that will allow you to move your index file system over to a modern database environment while still preserving the data structures and those access methods that your code is expecting. All right. So, what are some of the lower risks? Well, these tend to be the elements that are easier to modernize and don't have as direct of an impact on your application. So, for example, supporting components. How is your information routed to a printer? Are you using kind of a utility today? Would it make sense to replace that with something that's better suited for your new environment? There are other things such as, how do you normally do backups? Those are the type of components that you can consider replacing. Hardware is another consideration. Hardware servers tend to be relatively low price these days, so you have the option of scaling your application up by purchasing more powerful servers with a lot of memory, or you could scale your application out by installing it on multiple servers in a server farm. You can even choose to take your application up into the cloud. Security. If you were to take the .NET route for modernization, you can take advantage of .NET classes that tap directly into Active Directory. So you would be able to replace some of the security features that your application may have with something that's consistent across your environment. And also, although you're preserving your application's core business logic, you still now have the luxury of redesigning what your interfaces are going to look like. And as I mentioned before, you would have a number of options available to you in how you expose that data, be it through a web interface, web services, mobile applications, you name it. And last, moving to a new environment gives you an opportunity to explore new tools. There may be some tools that you were using in your old environment that don't maybe perform as well as you'd like. This does open up a new world for you. So let's say that you've decided that you want to modernize your COBOL. It's the right thing for you and your company to do. Well, what technology are you going to choose? You do have a lot of choices out there, but they pretty much fall into two major categories with a few exceptions, and that's .NET or Java. So for the purpose of this talk, what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on that .NET solution. So what are some of the benefits in .NET? Well, .NET offers a great framework with a rich set of classes that you can draw from. It also gives you freedom. And what I mean by freedom is the freedom to choose what language to develop in. So you could develop new applications in C#, VB.NET. There are a bunch of third-party languages out there, including NetCobol. .NET also makes it easier to deploy your applications, and you can deploy them in a number of different ways. So you can deploy them to a client-server environment, web environment. There are a lot of choices for you there. Also, Visual Studio is a great development environment. It's got a rich set of features, and it really does help you manage the various aspects of your code. Also, TFS. TFS integrates directly into Visual Studio, and it helps you manage that source code that you have. Allows you to put your source code in a good repository, and it also helps you coordinate the work you're doing on these on your source code. If you have several developers and they're all working on the same set of code, it helps control who has something checked out, when something gets checked in, and there's version history in there as well. This also opens up the possibility of using other Microsoft tools like Microsoft reporting services, which help present your data in better and more interesting ways to a wider audience. So let's talk a little bit about NetCobol for .NET. So first of all, NetCobol is a full .NET language. It not only supports native COBOL data types, but .NET data types as well. And it is fully interoperable with all of the other .NET languages. It's also fully integrated into Visual Studio. So we offer support for Visual Studio 2008 through 2012. The other interesting thing about NetCobol is that it allows you to maintain both object-oriented COBOL as well as procedural COBOL. And so what this means is that you could keep the procedural COBOL that you're working with today. It will run just fine in this new environment. If at such a time you want to convert it over to OO COBOL, that's certainly up to you, but it's certainly not something that you have to do. But what we believe is one of the major advantages to NetCobol is that we don't charge for any runtime fees. We tend to follow the .NET model of deployment. What you're paying for is the development environment. You're then free to distribute your COBOL applications anywhere and to anyone you want. So, imagine if you're paying for runtimes now and you sell software, you're either having to eat the cost of that runtime or you're passing it along to your customers. Imagine if you didn't have those runtime fees. There's a case there that you'd be able to have perhaps a competitive edge over the rest of your competition. And you also have to keep in mind that every dollar that you spend on runtime fees is a dollar that you can't spend on other tools or for other expenses. So what do you get with the NetCobol for .NET compiler? Well, first and foremost, it is an ANSI COBOL compliant compiler that's based on the 2002 COBOL standard. You're also getting a freely distributable COBOL language runtime for .NET. You can choose to install the runtime on your target machine, or you can bundle it in with your own software's install package so that it's very automatic and very easy for your users. With NetCobol, you get great performance. So why does that performance matter? Well, I'll admit there is value to the whole notion of compile once and run anywhere model, but there is a cost to that, and the cost is performance. Keep in mind that there are companies out there that have a lot of data that they have to process, usually in a very short time window. So for them, performance is really going to matter. So having those solutions that are scalable and having a compiler and a runtime that's able to grow with you as your business grows is really important. So Marge, why don't we go ahead and ask our second poll question?
Sure, thank you. So if the audience can please vote or give us their answer, that would be great. And why would you consider moving? Disregard if you can capture text. That I thought we had taken that out, but I guess we didn't. So why would you consider moving your COBOL? Would it be cost, flexibility, vendor relationship, or other? Wow. We've got about 10 more minutes. This is very interesting, the voting coming in, and I'll share it in a few minutes. We'll give it about 10 more seconds in case someone's multitasking on this webinar. If they can answer real quickly, that'd be great. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to share results. So Raul, are you surprised by any of these answers, or is it spot on with what you hear from the client base?
It's pretty spot on. The flexibility, usually flexibility and cost run pretty neck and neck. So it's interesting that in this poll, flexibility was kind of more the prevailing consideration. So, it's good.
Okay, great. Well, let me hide that so we can get back to the presentation.
All right, great. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch out of my PowerPoint slide deck, and I'm going to bring up my demo. So what you see here is a very basic Windows Form application. What I went ahead and did was I created a C# web form interface, and what it does is it is tying back directly to some legacy COBOL code that I have. And as you can see here, this is pretty much run-of-the-mill procedural COBOL logic. I have a select statement there that's reading from an indexed file. got a working storage section where I capture some of the information for customer information, pass it along through my linkage section. All pretty standard stuff. What I also did was I created what I like to call a COBOL helper class. And I didn't really need to create this. My C# program could have connected directly to my procedural code logic. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to expose some of those customer information elements as properties. And so I was able to do that with this COBOL class by specifying that those working storage variables are properties. What that does is it just makes it easier for the C# code to access and get to that information. So if we look at the C# code, again, pretty standard stuff. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. I'm going to pull my window over here. If I go ahead and enter in customer number, you'll see that I hit a breakpoint in my code. So I'm going to go ahead and, at this point what we've done is we've instantiated the COBOL helper class, and we're about to jump into one of its methods. So if I step into this, you'll see that I've stepped directly now into COBOL code. And what's great about the integration that we have with Visual COBOL is that your debugging experience is pretty rich. I can go ahead and I can hover over any of these variables and see exactly what their values are. And that includes data groups. And so in this case, my communication area data group has a bunch of variables underneath it. So let's continue on and step directly into my business logic. And at this point, this is all pretty standard stuff. If I go ahead and choose to run to where my cursor is, I'll see that by this time I've read my index file. If I hover over my communication area, I can see that I've got a bunch of values in here, and I've been able to pull information. I also have the option of being able to take something like this and attach it to my watch window, so I could then have it permanently expanded, and I have the luxury of being able to change any of these values on the fly. So let's go ahead and then just let this run. And what you see is I was able to retrieve information from my legacy COBOL code. At this point, I have the option of modifying any of this, hitting my update, and the whole process starts again. So what's interesting about this, or at least what I think is really neat, is you'll notice that I did break my solution up into two separate projects. I've got my C# project and my COBOL project. This COBOL project is going to create an assembly. It's going to create a module that I can now pick up and I can use and repurpose for other things. So let's imagine that your users come back to you and they say, yeah, the Windows form is all great, but what we really need is a web interface. Well, that's pretty easy to do. If we go ahead and we pull up my other project, I went ahead and I created an ASP.NET solution here. And again, you'll see somewhat of a familiar interface. But notice that I've also imported the same CusInfo core project in here as well. And so I've had to make absolutely no changes into that COBOL core logic. And I can use it and get the same results. So, I think that's pretty powerful stuff. It's certainly interesting. It's certainly fun to play with. Again, this environment, it gives you options. If you decide that you need to add some new functionality and you find that maybe it's easier to add that functionality in another .NET language, go ahead and do so. These languages all talk to each other. So let's go ahead and we're going to switch back to my presentation, and we're going to go ahead and cover our last topic for today, and that's diversifying your development talent pool. So one of the nice things about moving over to .NET is that it gives you the opportunity to retain your existing COBOL talent. So keep in mind that the COBOL developers you have, they know your company's business. They know its technical background, historical knowledge, why you did things in a particular way. The good thing about NetCOBOL is that your programmers aren't going to have to learn new languages. This is a great way to ease them into these new technologies. But you also have the opportunity to now tap into new talent. You can hire top-notch .NET developers that don't even necessarily program in COBOL. What it gives you the option of is hiring the right type of developer for the tasks that you have on hand. So, what are our takeaways? Well, we recommend keep your business logic. It works. It gets the job done. Go ahead and lower your risk by keeping your critical business logic intact and only modernizing the lower risk elements. We've shown that your COBOL logic can integrate quite well into the .NET environment. It's very interoperable. And last but not least, modernizing your code gives you the opportunity to diversify your development team. Use the right people for the right tasks. So at this point, that ends the presentation portion of the webinar. So thank you all for joining. And at this point, Marge, do we want to go ahead and move into the question and answer portion?
Sure. So I want to remind everybody, the audience, if they could go ahead and type in their questions if they have any. We have a few, but I do want to give the opportunity to submit questions. So we'll start with our first question as those other questions come in. Raul, the first question is, how do you handle proprietary syntax from competing compilers?
Oh, that's a good question. If you don't already know, different compiler brands have their own proprietary syntax. There's standard COBOL, and then there's the proprietary syntax. Hopefully, you've designed your code so that it uses mostly ANSI standards. But in the case where you don't, we do have tools that will help transition your code over from, let's say, Micro Focus or AccuCOBOL over to NetCOBOL compliant code. And what we normally do is we also try to, when we do convert, we try to stick to that ANSI standard so that, in turn, we're not introducing any proprietary syntax of our own. How difficult that is really depends on, the volume of work to be done and, the difficulty or the difficulty or, how in-depth or how much of that proprietary syntax you're using.
Okay, great. And we're getting a few more questions coming in. So the next one says, are there any tools to handle legacy screens?
Yes, there are. One of the tools that we actually recommend is the Flexus tool. And we are actually a reseller for that Flexus product line. And it does actually a very, very good job of being able to convert or migrate those old legacy screens over. So that's definitely something that you should contact us for, and check out.
Okay. I don't know if we'll have to take this offline or not, but this question is, how are the steps to migrate my applications in AccuCOBOL? I'm not sure if that's how many or how are the steps. So we may.
Well, again, that'll depend on how complicated your code is, and that probably would be maybe a better question to take offline. The answer there is going to be it depends. Again, it depends on how standard the code is that you're using, or are you using a lot of proprietary active COBOL syntax. The bottom line, though, is that we do have tools that will help convert that.
Okay. The next question is, does GT Software have similar tools to migrate, I don't know if that's off or to Java?
So is the question, do we have tools to help you migrate your code over to Java? No, at this time we don't. We can help you convert your code over to .NET or standard native COBOL, but not specifically to Java.
Great. And I believe this is the last question, unless we get any others. What is the typical learning curve for a COBOL developer to come up to speed in the .NET?
It's pretty quick, and part of that reason is that you have the option of continuing to work with your procedural COBOL code. So what I would say is, once you get the hang of working within Visual Studio, you start off with your COBOL programs, and over time, you're going to go ahead. You're going to start learning some of these newer techniques. You might even start learning some of the newer languages like C# or VB.NET.
Okay. We are getting a lot more questions, so I'm going to take 2 more and then we'll stop. We are using a lot of calls to Linux scripts. How can we use this on Linux?
We do have a Linux compiler. That would be a separate type of conversion, but one that could certainly be accomplished as well. So, I would say is I definitely encourage the person who asked that question to give us a call and see how we can help them. Okay,
great. And we've got about 3 or 4 more questions that have come in, so if we can take them, great. If we can't, we'll have to get back to the audience. But there is some ODBC from GT can I use instead of other vendor ODBC?
Yes, there is. So you can use, well, first of all, if you've moved all of your data, let's say off of a mainframe, you could use standard Windows ODBC into SQL Server, Oracle, whatever the database of your choice. GT Software also offers ODBC drivers if you elect to keep your data, let's say, on the mainframe. We have ODBC and actually even JDBC drivers that you'd be able to take advantage of.
Okay. Would your screen conversion tool handle V+ HP's 3000 MPE?
Actually, that is a good question. That would probably be another good one that we should probably take offline.
Okay.
Give a little bit more thought to.
Okay, and the last question, any experience migrating from AIX, Micro Focus, COBOL?
Yeah, I believe we actually have had a few opportunities like that in the past, and a couple of those customers opted for a Linux solution, and I think at least 2 or 3 opted for bringing their application over into the Windows environment. So those tend to be fairly straightforward migrations. So yeah, we can do
great. So that is the end of the webinar. I would like to just remind everybody that, one, we do have a free COBOL analysis. If you're interested in following up with us and maybe getting that analysis started, we do have it out on a web page, and we can send you that web page so you can download the form. The second thing is if you want to contact us, go to either sales@gtsoftware.com or info. You can also go to our website, and again, you are welcome to call into our organization too. So at this time, it concludes the webinar. Raul, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It was really interesting and very informative. So thank you.
Hey, thanks. Happy to do it, and thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.